Thanks, Phil. I'm Sean. I'm from Lancaster, as Bill said, from the International Observatory and Life Care in the UK. And I was involved very actively in collecting data in the UK for InSup-C. And out of that very personal experience and personal engagement with the project, I became quite interested in some of the responses and some of the people I saw who were living on their own towards the end of life. And I think it's true to say, of course, that we have an ageing population across the continent, perhaps across the globe. And we also have, and this came very much out of our data, a lot of people whose families kind of disperse and disappear. I think the time of people living in close connection with their close relatives, not moving so much, have really passed. And there was a lot of evidence, and I'll talk a little bit about this from some of the actual data that we collected. It's not always a negative experience, of course, but I think, as Bill said, it is important in terms of that particular point in life. Where do you get the support from if there's somebody not living in the house with you? So, of the total sample of patients that we spoke to across the 5 countries, around about 30% lived on their own. And in fact, that figure of 30% was replicated in certainly 4 of the countries, not so much Belgium, which had a smaller sample, overall sample, but about 30% was kind of replicated, which was interesting for me, because I had imagined that there would be different kind of societal and cultural norms in different countries, and perhaps what I was seeing in the UK is actually not going to be happening elsewhere, but in fact, I think, although a small sample, it demonstrates some consistency across the nations that took part in the study. The mean age of people, 73, with a range of 59 to 93, so generally an older population. And we collected more data from people with cancer, as has already been said. So 27 people had cancer out of that group. About half that number had COPD, and a further half of the COPD number had heart failure, with one curiously not known. And 58% of the sample were women. Again, so fairly good gender balance. So what were the fears and concerns of people? And these are just some of them really that I've grouped together. And probably not surprisingly, loneliness was really top of the tree. And lots of people mentioned this. Increasing illness leads to, obviously, increasing inability perhaps even to get out of the house. And we saw a number of people who very rarely went out. So living alone then meant increasing social isolation. I think as well in our data we found that some people's friends kind of backed off or disappeared, so even those limited networks that they might have had became smaller. People were also concerned about their dying process, about how they cope on their own with distressing symptoms. And a big thing for people was they didn't want to be a burden on others. And I'll go into some of these with some direct quotes from the data in a moment. But many people were concerned not to have to over-rely on friends and neighbours if they didn't have family members living nearby. But also there was evidence that people didn't want to disrupt the lives of their family members, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. Despite that, people talked about wanting to maintain autonomy and independence. I think David talked earlier about one of our tasks really being to try and really assist that process of maintaining independence for as long as possible. And so people in the sample talked about that. And I think for people living alone, discussions and decision making become much more critical and important. And I'll talk a bit about that in a moment, just in terms of how people might need, if they're living alone, to make decisions, say, to move into some sort of institutional care earlier than they might have done if they were living with somebody else. So just to unpack this a little bit. So a quote from the Netherlands, it's now a lonely home for me. Again, I think this is related perhaps to the fact that as increasing illness burden means that people can then not make those social connections that they might have done before. And when I talk to my son, who lives abroad, a quote from a Hungarian patient, I feel a little better, but bad thoughts come back at night. And the night issue came up a lot for people. Things are definitely worse for people, I think, from our sample then, when they're on their own and it's dark and they're not sure whether they're going to be okay. From the UK, loneliness, yes, it's best to be honest with you. Yeah, I'm very lonely a lot of the time. But of course, there are things that can help, and I'll talk about how the WHO responds to these sorts of needs in a moment. But this quote from Germany demonstrates something of that. I'm sitting here alone the whole day. When the volunteers are visiting me, then I have somebody to talk to, and that's a good feeling. And so in terms of the network of people who might respond, volunteers were mentioned a number of times, and volunteer-based services. And I think there are implications for how we as practitioners need to think about wider about the network of people that we get involved with. So being ill and dying alone, I mostly fear about regaining consciousness on the ground because I'm alone most of the time. Again, a worry for a lot of people that suddenly their symptoms would worsen, they wouldn't have anybody in the house just to simply call, it would mean having to get onto their mobile warden system in the UK perhaps, or maybe ringing a neighbour. So there was a lot of concern about that, and this whole thing about at night, no day passes without me thinking about death. And I also went through a period when I went to bed, I thought, how long will I still be lying in this bed? I talked about, I mentioned about people worrying about being a burden. So a quote from Belgium, I'm living alone and the children are coming at night to sleep with me, then I'm not alone, but that's so difficult and annoying because I don't want my illness to disrupt their family life. And again from Hungary, dependency on others makes me terribly sad. If I think about it, I could cry. I wish I could disappear because I don't want to be a burden. So, however, for some, maintaining independence and autonomy was important, and to continue to do the things that they'd always done. So, I've got no kids living around, they're all living abroad. Again, that thing about mobility of people, moving quite far away. And anyhow, I want to plan ahead myself. I did it all my life. And the importance of actually being seen by somebody, I think, is reflected in this quote from a person in the UK, who said that the home care workers that came in, obviously to deliver some sort of personal care, visited every day. And that's important because you don't know whether you're going to wake up in the morning or not. And that's something you don't want your family to find you in that sort of situation. So the idea for him was that although he was getting quite a lot of practical help, it was simply being seen by somebody that was important in his head. But, evidence therefore, data from the Netherlands, a patient saying that managing quite well, a little bit laid up currently, but other than that, I do everything and I'm quite in control. So I think what this points to is, despite the fact that we may want to respond, perhaps in this situation as professionals and practitioners, there does need to be a flexing and a sensitivity to people's wish and desire to do it for themselves if they can and for as long as they can. And I said also about decision making, it seemed to me, looking through the data, that people were having to make decisions perhaps to go into residential care earlier than they might have done if they were living with someone. And a quote from the UK, a woman saying that if it came to the point that she had to rely on her children to keep her in her own home, then that's the time to go somewhere else. She didn't want her children to be providing her care, and neither did she want to live with them. And in fact, this woman, that was from a baseline interview, and when I went back to see her 3 months later for her follow-up interview, she had moved into a care home and felt really happy with that decision. And mainly, she said, it was because at night, when she was lying in bed at that quiet, dark time, somebody would open her door, ask her if she was all right, wish her good night. And she just felt that sort of sense of security and safety that brought. So who responds? Well, professionals, of course. We've already heard in Hungary, I think, it seems that doctors regularly give their mobile phone numbers to patients, and that's a real commitment, and I don't know whether that's such a great thing, but demonstrates a lot of commitment. And this person here said, the doctor organises everything within a very short time, everything I need in order to survive, and I always get help immediately. And other professionals, UK-based community matron, referring somebody to hospice daycare services, I think largely with a view to reducing this person's isolation, social isolation. This woman in particular had a vast COPD and couldn't get beyond the front door of the house. So she comments that, well, now the hospice, although I was a bit worried about it because I don't have cancer, which says something, now that's my lifeline. It's the only time I get out. And the other sort of more general services, I've already quoted the man in the UK who was, for which home care is important, again in the Netherlands. They keep an eye on me. They saw my fat belly and said, do we need to call the doctor now? So that function that would normally happen within a home if you were living somewhere where someone might comment on, you're not looking so well today, do you think you need to see the doctor? It's now perhaps being provided by other people and becomes important if you're on your own. But there was an awful lot of dependency on support, on informal support networks, so not the professionals, friends and acquaintances accompanying me, working or going out for a stroll or driving out somewhere, so I can get out and don't feel so alone. And more practical help. So Felix, who lives right across the street, I'm always glad when he comes. He's been to the pharmacist once, and other neighbours will do such things. But the question that arose really for me is, aren't these common, a lot of these things, for anybody approaching the end of life? And a study from, a couple of key conclusions from a study conducted by Barbara Hanratty and her colleagues in the UK in 2013 about living alone with cancer in old age. Among the conclusions from that, they said that opportunities to discuss care options are essential in maintaining independence for older people living alone in the last year of life. And of course, many of these conversations, if there isn't a family member, need to be conducted by professionals or people with that sort of a relationship with the patient concerned. So relational continuity over time, building up trusting relationships in order to have those sensitive conversations is important. So some conclusions.